My father found my mother on the river rocks. The spring the Calder came up over its banks and took 3 fences, a wagon and old Peter Sull's whole barn down to Culver's Crossing. I have told this story at my own fire more times than I can count, and every time a young man leans in at the part where the two worlds meet, waiting for the shooting to start. There is no shooting in it. That is the thing they never expect, and the thing I most want them to carry. That the hardest divide on the whole frontier was crossed by a man who set his rifle down and a woman who would not be made small, and that a home came out of it, and that home was me. I was not born yet. I am telling you what my father told me by the stove in his old age, and what my mother told me in her own tongue when she thought I was asleep, and I have put the two together the way you'd fit a broken cup, and I believe it comes out true. The Calder was brown and loud that morning and climbing. My father, Amos Cade, though the town mostly called him that quiet one out on the draw, when it called him anything, had come down to pull his 3 head off the low ground before the river took the grass. He was a man who spoke to his horse more than to people, and I have come to understand it was not meanness in him, but a wound he carried up from somewhere back east, a grief he never once named to me, but that sat behind his eyes like a stone at the bottom of a clear pool. He drifted west with it, bought 40 hard acres in the wildcat draw that nobody else wanted because it sat too close to the high country, and there he meant to be left alone until the end of his days. The river had other plans. He heard her before he saw her. Not a cry my mother did not cry out, not then, not ever that I knew, but a sound the water made going wrong, a churn against something that shouldn't be in it. He rode down through the willows with the wet slapping his horse's legs, and there on the black rocks where the Calder bent, half in the flood and half out, was a woman. She was Apache. He knew it the moment he saw the cut of her dress and the beadwork gone dark with river water, and a lesser man, a Culver's Crossing man, might have turned his horse right there, and let the river finish what it started. There'd been trouble in the valley the years before, cattle gone, a burned line shack, a boy killed on each side, the old ugly arithmetic of fear that never once added up to peace. The town and the high country did not speak. They watched each other across the divide the way 2 dogs watch, hackles up, and waited for the other to lunge. My father looked at her a long moment. Then he got down off his horse into the cold brown water up to his waist, and he went and got her. The current wanted her. He learned that going in. The Calder pulled at his boots and tried to walk him downstream, and it had a mean cold weight to it, snowmelt weight, the kind that stops a man's chest. He got a hand into the wet cloth at her shoulder and another under her arm, and he hauled, and she came off the rocks heavy and loose the way a thing comes when it's given up. And for one bad second in the middle of that river, he thought he had reached into the flood and pulled out the dead. Then her head lolled against his shoulder, and she made a sound, small, a living sound, water and breath, and my father set his jaw and walked her out of the Calder one hard step at a time with the river hauling at them both the whole way, and he did not let go. She was alive. Broke somewhere in the leg, he could feel it wrong when he lifted her, the shin gone where a shin shouldn't go, and a gash above her ear laid open white to the bone, and cold, so cold that when he got her up onto the bank and pressed 2 fingers to her throat to find the beat of her, he almost couldn't find it, faint and slow and far down, like a hoof heard through a lot of ground. He wrapped her in his own coat and slung her across his saddle, belly down and careful of the leg, and he led the horse up out of the willows at a walk because a trot would have jarred the broke bone, and it was only when he came up onto the flat, dripping, his own hands gone blue and stupid with the cold, that he happened to look up. They were on the ridge. He never knew how many. 4, maybe 5, mounted still as the rimrock behind them, watching down from the high country where the Pinion started. Apache riders, her people. They had come down after the flood too, looking, because she had gone out that morning and not come back. I understood later, and a healer who does not come back sends her whole band out along the swollen river reading the banks. And they had watched a white man take her out of the water and lay her over his saddle like a shot deer, and they made no move at all. My father was not a fool. He knew what it looked like from up there. It looked like the oldest story on the frontier, the one that ends in fire. He stood there in the wet with his hands empty, and his rifle in the scabbard under her body, out of his reach, and he did the only honest thing a man can do at such a moment. He looked back up at them and lifted one open hand, slow, so they could see it held nothing, and held it there against the gray sky a long while. Then he pointed to the woman and to himself, and down the draw toward his cabin, and he touched 2 fingers to the gash on his own head and shook his head slow, hurt. "I will tend, not this way you fear." For a long moment, nothing moved on the ridge. The wind came down off the high country and worried the pinyon and moved nothing else. My father said later it was the longest quiet of his whole life, longer than the war he never spoke of, longer than the graves back east he never spoke of either. That one gray stretch of standing in the wet with an unarmed hand, raised to 5 men who had every reason on God's earth to kill him. Then the lead rider, an older man, my father said, straight-backed, with a red band at his brow, lifted his own hand. Open, just once, and they turned their horses and were gone into the pinyon like smoke, and my father stood alone in the wet with a broken stranger over his saddle and no idea on this earth what he had just agreed to. He took her home. What else was there? The ride back up the draw was slow, and it was the longest 2 miles he ever rode. He walked the horse and kept one hand back on her the whole way to steady the broke leg, and he talked to her low, the way he talked to stock, not because he thought she could hear, but because a man has to put his fear somewhere, and my father put his into a low, steady stream of nothing words. Easy now, easy. We're near, easy, all the way up the draw to the cabin in the gray afternoon light. Our cabin in those years was 1 room and a lean-to, a stone chimney my father laid himself, a puncheon floor he'd adzed flat, a rope bed with a corn-shuck tick. He'd built it for 1 man to be alone in, and it had never held anyone but him. He got her down off the saddle as gentle as his cold hands would let him, and he carried her in and laid her on the bed, and then he stood there a moment lost, a solitary man with a dying woman in his 1 room and the light going, and I think that was the moment his whole careful walled-off life came down, though he'd not have said so. He knew only that there was work. He built the fire up till the 1 room roared. He got the wet coat off her and the wet dress cut away at the seam, and I will tell you plainly he did it with his eyes on the leg and the wound and nowhere else, because that was the manner of the man, and because he told me so himself in his old age with the fire on his face, and my father did not lie, not to me, not ever. He got her into a dry shirt of his own, the softest he had, and heaped every blanket he owned on her and warmed river stones at the hearth and wrapped them in cloth and packed them around her to drive the cold out. And slow, over the first long night, the terrible far-off slowness went out of her heartbeat, and it came up nearer and steadier, and my father sat on the floor by the bed and fed the fire and did not sleep. In the gray of the morning he set the leg. He'd set legs on stock, and he'd set his own broke arm once, alone in a line shack, with a rope and a door frame, so he was not without the knowledge, but a woman's shin is not a steer's cannon bone, and he was a long time getting up the nerve. He cut a straight willow and whittled 2 splints smooth so no rough wood would gall her. He tore his 1 good shirt, the white one he'd bought in the crossing 2 years back and worn maybe twice, into strips, because it was the cleanest cloth in the house. Then he took her foot in his 2 hands and he braced, and he pulled the bone straight, and she came up screaming out of her fever swim, a sound that near stopped his heart, words in her own tongue flung at him hot and afraid, and he held the leg true through all of it and got the splints bound, and only when it was done did he let himself shake. He sat back against the wall, and his hands shook for a while. Then he got up and sewed the gash above her ear with a horsehair boiled clean and a sailmaker's needle, his big scarred hands surprisingly fine at the small work. humming low the whole time, some old tune with no words left to it, and she quieted under the humming though she was still deep in the fever, and slept. She woke, all the way woke on the second day. My father was at the stove. He heard the bed, a shift of the rope, a catch of breath, and he turned, and there she was up on one elbow, black eyes open and clear and hard on him, and every muscle in her ready. She had found, somehow in the dark before he turned, the knife from the shelf by the bed. She held it low and steady, point toward him, and she watched him the way you watch a wolf you've cornered but not beaten, and there was no fear in her face at all, only a still and total readiness. My father did not move toward her. He was holding a spoon, he'd been stirring cornmeal, and he set the spoon down slow on the stove edge and let his hands hang open and empty at his sides. He did not speak. He looked at her and let her look at him, and he let the fire crack and the pot tick and the moment stretch. And then, moving slow as cold honey so she could read every inch of it, he crossed the room to the far wall where his rifle hung on 2 pegs. Her eyes went hard as struck flint at that. Her grip shifted on the knife. He took the rifle down, and he carried it slow, and he laid it on the floor at the foot of the bed within her reach, the stock toward her hand, and then he backed off all the way across the room and sat himself down on the puncheon floor against the far wall with his empty hands open on his knees, and he made himself small, and he waited. They looked at each other across that room a long, long time, long enough that the cornmeal caught and started to scorch, and my father did not get up to save it, long enough that the light moved on the floor. She looked at the rifle at her feet and the knife in her hand, and the man sitting unarmed against his own wall in his own house, having given her, deliberately, the only gun in the room. And something in the arithmetic of it did not come out the way fear said it should. A wicked man does not disarm himself. A man who means you harm does not put the rifle in your hand and sit down empty across the room. My mother was no green girl. She had seen what men were. She told me so, plain, when I was old enough to hear it, and she read that room the way she read the ground and the sky, and she read it true. She did not put the knife down. She was nobody's fool. The knife stayed. But she eased back onto the pillow, and the point of it drifted down toward the quilt, and my father let out the first full breath he'd drawn in 2 days, and got up at last to scrape the ruined cornmeal off the pot and start again. "Cade," he said, when he'd set the fresh pot on. He touched his own chest. "Amos Cade." She watched him and said nothing. He filled the tin cup with water and carried it over and set it on the milking stool within her reach and backed away, and she let it sit a good while, to prove to them both that she could, that thirst did not rule her and he did not rule her. Then, on her own time, by her own leave, she drank. And that, a cup of water taken by her own choice, in her own time, my mother always said was the first thing that passed between them that was freely given and freely taken. And she said everything else that ever came after grew up out of that one small root. Her name I will give you the way she gave it to me, because it matters that you hear it right, and not the flattened thing the town later made of it. In her people's tongue it was a word that turned on the tongue like water over stone, and it meant, near as English will carry it, the one who mends, for she was a healer of her band, trained from a girl by the old women, keeper of the plants and the songs that go with them, a person of standing among her people, sent for in the night, trusted with the living and the dying. It was gathering the spring medicine along the swollen river that the flood had caught her. The good roots come up in the wet ground of the spring rise, and she had gone too near the climbing water reaching for them, and the bank had let go under her. She told my father her name on the 4th day, when the fever broke clean and left her weak and clear-headed and hungry. He could not say it right. He tried and made a mess of it, and she watched him fail at it 3 times with something at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was headed that way. On the 4th try he got the shape of it. Nahini. She nodded once, grave as a judge, and I think that nod was the first stone laid in the bridge that became my whole life. Now I want to be careful here, because young men at my fire always want this part to move faster than it did, and it did not move fast, and the slowness is the truth of it. There was no lightning in it. There was a broke leg that took its weeks to knit, and two people who had no common tongue and a valley's worth of blood between their peoples, learning each other one plain day at a time. They had no words in common. What they had was work, and a house is a small place, and there is always work in it, and work is a language of its own that needs no grammar. She saw him favoring a hand on the 5th day. He'd torn it on the wire pulling the cattle out of the flood, a long dirty gash across the meat of the palm, and he'd wrapped it and forgot it the way a hard-used man forgets his own hurts, and it had gone bad. It was hot and swelling, and the red was starting to creep up past his wrist in a thin line, and a frontier man will lose a hand that way, and then his arm, and then his life, and not say a word until the fevers got him. My mother, propped up in the bed where she could not yet stand, saw him wince closing his fist on the coffee pot, and she said something sharp and pointed. He didn't understand. She said it again and pointed harder at his hand, and made a grabbing motion, "Bring it here." He brought it. She was still too weak to rise, so she took his hand across the edge of the bed into her two hands, and turned it to the light from the window, and pressed the swelling, and he flinched, and she made a sound in her throat that in any tongue on earth means *fool. Then she looked up at him, and she pointed to the door, and to the ground beyond it, and she began to name plants he did not know, words that meant nothing to him, and when he only stared, she cast about and found a burnt stick fallen from the hearth, and she reached down and drew in the cool ashes at the stove front a leaf, notched a certain way, a root, forked a certain way, and pointed again hard to the country outside the door. My father took a sack and went out and brought back everything green he could find that matched her ash drawings. Most of it was wrong. She sat up against the wall and sorted through his sackful with quick, sure fingers, and threw the wrong things one by one out the door, and the two right things, a low gray-green leaf and a pale forked root, she kept. She had him pound the root between two stones and steep the leaf in hot water, directing him with her hands and a scold in her voice when he did it clumsy, and she made a poultice of the mash and bound it to his hand with a strip of the clean cloth, and she sang over it, low, not for him, for the work. That was her way always. The song went with the medicine the way the second horse goes with the first. And I would hear that low singing all through my childhood, and it is the sound I hear still when I think of being small and safe. In 3 days the hand that would have killed him came down cool and clean, the red line gone, the swelling drained, the gash closing pink and healthy. My father flexed it slow in the firelight, turning it in the light the way she'd turned it, and he looked at her across the room a long moment, and he said the only thing his stone heart could get out, which was, "Obliged." She did not have the word, but she had the thing under the word, and she inclined her head the grave way she had, and I think that was the second stone. That was the shape of it, all through that long spring. He learned her plants and she learned his stock. She showed him a poultice that drew the swelling out of a horse's hoof abscess, and saved a good sorrel he'd have had to shoot. She stood in the corral leaning on a stick, her leg still splinted, and directed him through it. And when the horse came sound, she looked at my father with a flat satisfaction. There, you see, and he did see. He showed her the old mule that would let anyone ride, and when the splint came off her leg, she took it off herself, before he thought it was time, and stood, and walked the length of the room and back on her own 2 feet, pale and set-jawed, to prove she could. He put her up on the mule and let it slow around the yard so she could feel the country from horseback again, and she sat that mule straight-backed and looked out at the draw and the far high country of her people. And something came into her face that was longing and was not weakness, and my father saw it, and led the mule where she pointed, toward the mouth of the draw where you could see up into the pinion, and let her look, and did not hurry her. She mended his clothes. Not because he asked, he'd never have asked. He'd have gone in rags, but because idle hands were not in her, and a healer of a people who wasted nothing could not sit in a house watching a man's shirts fall off his back. She took his torn things and his needle and set to, and she mended better than he ever had, small true stitches, and she made over one of his big shirts to fit herself while the last of her own dress dried and mended, and she moved around the one room after that in a man's blue shirt cinched with a strip of hide, and my father said the sight of her doing the small, ordinary work of the house, a woman where no woman had ever been, mending by the window in the evening light, did something to the walled-off place in him that he had thought was walled off for good. And in the evenings, the language. He'd carry his coffee to the door of a warm spring evening, and she'd sit on the step below him with the mending or with a root she was splitting to dry, and he'd point to a thing, the ridge going blue, the first star, the far wavering howl of a wolf up in the pinion, and say the English word plain and wait, and she'd say her people's word back, careful and wait, and the two words would sit together in the dark between them like two people learning not to be strangers. Star, ridge, fire, water, horse, cold, bread. She learned faster than he did. She had the healer's ear, trained to hear the exact word for the exact plant, the small difference that was the difference between medicine and poison. And before long she was stringing his words into little strings, and correcting his tongue when he mangled hers, and never once did she let him correct hers, only listened, hungry, when she spoke, like a man who'd been alone so long the sound of another human voice was food and drink to him. I have thought all my life that a language is just a fence you either climb or you don't, and that my mother and father spent that spring climbing it, one word at a time, on a cabin step in the dark, and that they never once pretended the fence was not there. That is precisely why they got over it. It is the ones who pretend there is no fence who break their necks on it. My mother and father looked the fence dead in the eye every single evening and set their hands to it and climbed together, and by the summer they could talk, haltingly, in a patched-together tongue of her words and his, with their hands filling the gaps, and they had told each other, by then, in that patchwork, a good deal of who they were. She learned that his grief was a wife and a child, back east, taken in a sickness he'd not been able to doctor, and that he'd come west to a country empty enough to hold the size of it. She did not flinch from it, and she did not fill the silence after with the useless words the crossing would have. She was of a people who knew grief was carried and not cured. She only, once, laid her hand flat on the table between them and left it there, and that was all, and it was enough. And he learned that her people were fewer than they had been, that the good country was closing on them year by year, that she had lost people too, that she carried her own stones. Two solitary people, each with a full pack of grief, learning each other's weight in the dark. And her people watched. I did not know this for years, but they knew where she was the whole time. Of course they did. It was their country. They read it like scripture, and they were letting her mend and letting her choose. More than once she walked out in the cool of the morning and stood a long while at the mouth of the draw facing the high pinion, and once a rider came halfway down the near rise and stopped, and it was a woman, one of the old healers who had trained her, and the two of them stood a quarter-mile apart in the early light and spoke across the distance in the carrying way of the high country, and my mother went up and they sat together on the rocks an hour. And my father watched from the corral and did not go near and did not reach for the rifle, and when the old woman rode back up into the pinion, my mother came down to the cabin and her face was easier, and my father asked nothing, and she told him anyway in their patched tongue. Her people knew she lived. Her people were waiting. The choice was hers, and her father, the man with the red band, would want before long to look at this white man with his own eyes. My father took that the way he took hard weather coming. He nodded and went on with the work and got ready. The leg knit clean and strong. She could walk and ride and go home. And the day came, early summer now, the draw green to the knee, the Calder back down between its banks and running clear over the black rocks where he'd found her, when there was no more reason under heaven for her to stay in Amos Cade's cabin, except the one reason neither of them had yet said out loud. And on that morning my father did the thing that I think, of all the things in this long story, is the thing that made my mother love him, though neither of them would have used the word yet. He packed a horse for her. He rose before light and he went to his small, mean store of everything and he cut it near in half. Flour, coffee, the last of the good coffee, a side of bacon, sugar, which he almost never had, the good blanket off his own bed, the Hudson's Bay 4-point he'd carried west from the old life, the one warm thing he owned. He loaded it all on the gentle mule, and he saddled the sound sorrel she'd healed, and he stood in the yard in the first light with the lead rope in one hand and his hat in the other, and when she came to the cabin door he said, plain, "I'll take you up to your people far as you say, today if you're ready." I have tried all my life to imagine my mother's face at that moment, and I cannot quite do it. She had come to his house an enemy on the water, half dead. She had mended under his roof, and she had known, for she was no green girl, she had seen what men were, and what they did with a woman alone and a wide, empty country to hide it in, that a man in his position had on this frontier, more or less whatever he decided to take, and that no law and no soul would ever come looking. And here he stood in the summer dawn with a packed horse and the good blanket off his own bed, giving her the road home, not keeping her, not bargaining, not asking for one thing in return. Freeing her the way you free a hawk you've splinted and mended. You carry it out into the open, and you open your hand and you give the sky back its own, and you do not get to say whether it circles once before it goes, or ever comes back at all. She looked at the packed horse a long time, then she looked at him. And she said in English, the words slow and careful and level because she had been saving them, building them word by word on that doorstep in the dark evenings against exactly this day. "You come to my people, I say you." And she touched her own chest and then leveled one hand at him, and I understood, when she told me this herself years later in the firelight, that she was not asking him to take her home. She was telling him she would take him, that she would ride him up into the high country herself and stand him before her father and speak for him before her whole band, and that this was a thing of enormous weight, a thing that could go very wrong for both of them, a thing not one person in 10 on either side of that divide would have dared, and that she chose to do it, freely, her road, her choice. My father, who had risen that morning braced to lose her, stood in his own yard with a lead rope in his hand, and could not for a moment speak. Then he put his hat on, and he got his own horse, and they rode up together into the high country in the summer morning, the packed mule trailing, 2 people going up the trail toward whatever waited. I will not pretend the high country welcomed him. It did not at first, and why on earth would it? He was the valley made flesh, the fences, the fear, the burned line shack, the dead boy riding up their own trail behind their own healer as if he had any right to the thin, high air. The young men met them a full mile down the trail and fell in alongside, silent, their faces closed, their hands never quite far from what they carried, and my father kept his own hands wide of the rifle and his eyes ahead, and let my mother lead and set the pace, because he had the sense, the rare, saving sense that I think was the best thing in him. To know that up here he was the ignorant one, and she was the wise one. And that a man who knows the true shape of his own ignorance is already halfway to being trusted. The camp was in a high park where 3 springs came together, a good place, grass and water and shelter and a long view, and my father came into it behind my mother with a dozen pairs of eyes on him and children pulled back into doorways and the whole place gone still and watchful. And there, outside his lodge, sat the man with the red band. He was headman of that band, my grandfather, a man of many years and great stillness, and he did not rise when they came, and he did not make my father welcome, and he did not look away either. He sat and let them come to him across the camp, every step of that walk watched by every soul in it, and he looked at my father the way an old man looks at weather building on the horizon, reading it, weighing it, deciding whether to bring the stock in or let it ride. My mother spoke first, and she spoke long in her own tongue, and my father caught maybe 1 word in 10 of it. His own name, the word for water, the word for hand, the word for the flood, but he understood the whole of it perfectly from the way she stood while she said it. Straight, unhurried, level, a grown woman of standing giving a true and full account to her father and her people. She was not, I want to be plain, asking her father's leave to love a white man. The town would later tell it that way, the poor squaw begging for the white man, and it was a lie top to bottom. She was giving her father and her band the truth of what had happened in their country, that the river had taken her, and that a man of the valley had gone into the flood after her when he could have ridden on, and had mended her leg and her head with his own hands and asked nothing, and had packed a horse to send her home free rather than keep her, so that her people would know that one honest thing, at least, had happened between the two worlds, and could weigh for themselves what it meant. That was her right, as a grown woman and a healer of the band, and she took it, standing in the center of her own camp with her chin up. The old man heard her all the way out. Then he turned his eyes full on my father and he spoke a few words, and my mother turned to put them into English, and my father stopped her, gentle with a lifted hand, because he had understood the shape of what was asked, and he answered the old man directly, in the few halting words of her tongue he had, filling all the rest with his open hands and his plain, weathered face, because he had come to understand in that long spring that a man does not send his heart up to another man through a third mouth, not at a moment like this one. What the old man had asked him was this: why did you take her from the river? And my father, in her words where he had them and his own where he did not, and his open hands for the rest, answered, because she was drowning, and I had hands. There was a long silence in the high camp. The 3 springs ran. The wind moved in the pinyon. And then the old man, my grandfather, whom I would not meet for 2 more years yet, and would come to sit beside and call by their word for the mother's father, and would learn from him the songs my mother sang over the medicine and a good deal else besides. The old man made a small sound low in his chest, and it was, of all the things it could have been, near to a laugh, not a mocking one. It was the laugh a hard old man gives when a plain truth walks up out of nowhere and sits itself down in front of him, and there is simply nothing there to argue with. He gave my father nothing that day, no blessing, no welcome in words, but he let him stay the night in the camp, which on that frontier in those years between those 2 peoples was a thing so nearly unheard of that my mother told me she stood watching the young men's faces through the whole of that evening to see if it would hold, if some cousin with a dead brother would not be able to bear the sight of a valley man at the fire. It held. My father sat at the edge of the fire that night, quiet, taking nothing, offering nothing, watching the flames and the stars come out over the high park, and one by one the hardest faces eased, not to welcome, but to a kind of grudging watchfulness that was a long way from the guns of the trail. A child crept out at last and stared at him from a safe distance, and my father, slow, so as not to startle it, took a bit of whittling from his pocket. He was always whittling, a habit of the long alone years, and worked at it in the firelight, and it took the shape of a little running horse, and when it was done, he set it on the ground and pushed it a little way toward the child and went back to watching the fire, and after a long while a small hand darted out and took it. And that was my father's first friend in the high country, a child, and the little horse, I am told, was kept for years. In the gray before dawn, my father saddled to ride back down to his 40 acres alone. He had come up only to be spoken for, and not to presume, and to have stayed longer would have been to presume, and he knew it. My mother walked out with him to the edge of the pinyon where the trail dropped away toward the draw, and there, with her whole camp behind her and the valley laid out gray and far below, she made her choice in front of everyone, which was the only place worth making it. She did not go down with him, not yet. But she reached up and took a strand of the beadwork from her own dress. The dark blue beads, the very ones my father had cut wet off her broken leg that first night and dried by his fire and given back to her folded careful in a clean square of cloth, which she had noticed, which she had never once forgotten, and she pressed the strand into his hand and closed his rough fingers over it, and she said, "I come. When the moon fills, my road, I choose. My road." I choose. She said it in the English she had built for herself word by word on his doorstep in the dark, plain and level, so there could be no mistaking it. And my father closed his hand around her beads, and I think he knew, in that gray dawn at the edge of the high country, that whatever grief he had carried west from the old buried life had finally, at last, been outweighed on the true scale by something coming the other way. He rode down alone into the draw with her beads in his shirt pocket over his heart, and he waited for the moon to fill. It was the longest waiting of his life, longer than the ridge, and he filled it with work the way a man does. He cut and stacked hay against the winter. He made over the cabin he built on. He knew, though neither of them had spoken it as a plan, that a woman was coming, and so he built for a woman. He laid a second room. He made a real bed, wide, with a rope frame he strung tight and true. He built a proper table with 2 benches where there had only been 1 stool. He cut a window on the east side so the morning would come in. He worked from dark to dark, and every night he took her beads out of his shirt and set them on the mantel where he'd see them first thing. And every day he watched the moon fatten over the high country, and he did not let himself be sure she'd come, because a man who has already lost one whole life does not let himself be sure of anything. But he built the room and the bed and the window the way you build a thing for someone, as a kind of prayer with your hands. She came when it filled. She came riding down out of the high country in the full white moonlight with 2 of the old women beside her, and the medicine bundle across her saddle, and her own people's things packed careful behind. She came down of her own road, on her own choice, in the light so bright you could have counted the pinion on the ridge. And my father stood in the yard where he had once packed a horse to lose her, and he watched her come the whole long way down the draw without moving a muscle. Because I think he was mortally afraid that if he moved it would prove to have been a dream after all, and the yard would be empty, and the moon would be shining on nothing but the grass. It was not a dream. She got down at his gate. The 2 old women got down behind her. And my mother walked up to my father through the white light and stood in front of him close, and looked up into his weathered face. And there in his own yard, in front of her elders and the whole wide indifferent night, she chose him out loud in both tongues, so that there could never after be any doubt in this world or the next whose choice it had been. They married in both ways, because my mother would have it no other way, and my father, who had learned by then that her way was the wiser one, agreed with his whole heart. Her people came down into the draw, a thing that had never happened, valley men lining the far fence rail of the crossing road to gape at it. And there was the joining of her band, the old women singing. The medicine burned sweet, her father blessing it at the last with his open hand, the same open hand he had lifted to my father across the flooded river that first gray morning, given now whole and freely. And there was a plain frontier vow too, said by a circuit preacher my father hauled 2 days up from the flats, so that the town's paper and the town's law would call her his wife, and no man living could ever say she was less than a wife, or that her son was less than a son. She stood for both, proud, and used to say a person could belong to 2 worlds the way a river belongs to 2 banks, and be the fuller and the stronger for it, and be the very thing that carries the life between the one and the other. But the town was not done with them, and I promised you the 2 worlds came within a held breath of blood, and they did, and it is the last hard thing I have to tell before the end. Word had gone down to Culver's Crossing that Amos Cade had taken an Apache woman for a wife out on his draw, and the town chewed on it the way a dog worries a wound it can't leave be. Most let it lie. Most of the crossing were tired farmers who wanted rain and a fair price for their beef, and no more dead boys on either side. And an Apache woman married proper by a preacher out on a hard 40 in the draw was, to them, a strangeness they could shrug at and go back to their plows. But there is always a faction, in every town that ever drew breath, that needs an enemy the way a fire needs wood and will go out without one, and the Crossings faction had a leader, a big cattleman named Harlan Boyd who ran a lot of stock on the flats below the draw. Boyd had lost a brother in the old troubles, years back, and he had decided, in the way such men do, that his grief was a debt the whole world owed him, and that he was entitled to collect it off anyone whose face fit the shape of his loss. That summer Boyd lost cattle, a dozen head off his lower range, gone in a week. Now cattle are lost 100 honest ways that have nothing to do with any man. They stray, they bog, they die in a wash. They are run off by a cougar. They simply wander through a downed fence and are gone. But Boyd had his enemy picked out before he'd even finished counting. And one hot morning he rode up the draw to my father's gate with 6 armed men behind him and a face like a shut door. And he said the Apache were thieving his stock, and that Cade's woman was their eyes and their ears, signaling her people down off the high ridge, and that he'd come to put a stop to the whole arrangement, one way or the other. My father stood in his own gate with his rifle in the crook of his arm. He did not lay it down for Harlan Boyd, and I have been glad of that all my life. A man ought to know which callers get the open empty hand, and which get the rifle held plain and level. And he said, quiet, "There's no thieving off my draw, Boyd, and none I know of off your flats. You've lost cattle. Ride your own washes and your own down fences before you ride up to my gate with 6 guns to threaten my wife." Boyd said a thing then about my mother that I will not put in my own mouth even to tell you how ugly it was. And my mother, who had come to the cabin door at the sound of the horses, understood the tone of it well enough if not every word, and she did a thing that I think of every single time in my long life I have heard one man call another people cowards, or savages, or less. She walked out, past my father, past the rifle held level in the crook of his arm, out into the bright open dust of the yard, into the space between her husband and Harlan Boyd's 6 mounted guns, her hands empty and open and hanging loose at her sides, and she stopped there in the full sun where every man could see there was nothing in her hands and nothing behind her but a cabin, and she looked up at Harlan Boyd on his big horse, and she spoke. She spoke in English, slow and clear and level, so that every man in that yard would carry every word of it home. She said the high band had not touched his cattle. She would know they were her people and they were hungry that summer, the good country closing on them, and they had said so among themselves, plain. And hungry people who took a rich man's beef to feed their children would not have hidden it and crept about. They would have taken it in the open and been proud to feed their own, for there is no shame in a hungry man eating. It was the fat and frightened towns that lied about such things, she said, not the high country. And then she made Harlan Boyd an offer, standing there unarmed under 6 guns in the noon sun. She said if he had truly lost stock, she would go herself with him into the washes and the low bogs and the down fences and read the ground, for she could read a track and a sign he could not. She said it plain without a boast in it, the way a person states a fact, and she would show him where his cattle had gone. And if her people had them, she would say so to his face in front of his own men and not spare herself the saying. There is a kind of courage that stops the whole world for a moment while men decide what they are. It stopped Boyd's yard cold. His 6 men shifted in their saddles and would not quite look at one another. It is one thing to ride up a trail hating a shadow you have never had to look in the eye. It is another thing entirely when the shadow walks out into the noon light on her own 2 feet and offers you, calm as a Sunday morning, to help you find your lost cows. And into that stopped and swaying moment, down the trail from the high country, came riders. My mother's father, the old man with the red band and a dozen of the band behind him, come down off the ridge, not for war. I understood only later, but because they too had heard by their own swift ways that Harlan Boyd was riding up the draw with guns toward the cabin, and a father does not sit in the high country warming his hands while 6 armed men ride at his daughter's door. They came down the trail slow and open, in the daylight, no war paint, no rush, and they stopped at the mouth of the yard and sat their horses. And for one long, long breath the whole terrible arithmetic of the frontier hung in the hot air over that little hard 140 acres, 6 town guns on one side, a dozen mounted Apache on the other, one white rancher in the gate with a level rifle, and there, in the very center of it all, in the dust, in the sun, one unarmed woman with her empty hands open at her sides. It could have gone to blood right there. One frightened hand on one trigger, one green boy on either side who could not hold his nerve, and it goes. And then the whole valley has the war it has been circling for a decade, and my father has a grave in the draw instead of a wife, and the high band buries more of its young, and I am never born at all. I want you to feel the whole of it, the way I have felt it my whole life. Everything I am, everyone who has come after me, my children and theirs, all of it hung in the balance on that one held breath in the dust, and not one gun in that yard could have saved it. Only she could. And she did it with mercy and not with a gun. She turned first to her father and spoke, quick and clear in their tongue, and he heard her and did not move his hand toward anything, only sat his horse and watched, grave, and let her work. Then she turned back to Harlan Boyd, and she made herself, out loud in the dust, the bridge she had been quietly becoming all that long spring and summer. She told Boyd, here then were the very people he accused, come down in the open in broad daylight before all these witnesses, not skulking, not signaling, but here in the sun. And they would ride the washes with him now, this hour, and find his cattle. And when the cattle were found bogged or drowned or strayed in some flooded draw where they had wandered on their own, as she knew in her bones they would be, then Harlan Boyd would owe the high country an honest word in front of his own men, and she would settle the whole account for that one honest word, and not ask for one drop more. And they went. That is the part that always lands like a dropped stone among the young men at my fire, who have been waiting the whole story for the shooting. They went. Town and high country, my father and the old man and Harlan Boyd and his six, the whole armed and hating lot of them, rode out together across the low flats in the long slanting light of that afternoon, with my mother out ahead of them all on the sound sorrel, reading the ground. She read it the way I have never seen anyone read anything since. She read the bent grass and the churned mud and the sign at the water, and she took that armed and silent company 2 miles down below Boyd's own line, to a wide flooded wash where the same high snowmelt water that had once nearly drowned her had backed up into a bog, and there they were. 11 head of Harlan Boyd's cattle, bogged and drowned and swelling in the mud, no more stolen than the rain was stolen, dead of nothing but their own dumb wandering and the same flood that had started this whole story. My mother sat her horse over them and said not one word. She only looked once at Harlan Boyd and let the drowned cattle in the mud do all of her talking for her. Boyd did not apologize that day. He was not that kind of made-over man, and I will not lie to you and tell you he became one in an afternoon. The frontier was not a Sunday school story, and hard men do not turn to gold between noon and dark. But he took his hat off. For Harlan Boyd, in front of his own men, over the drowned bodies of the cattle he'd been ready to start a war over, taking his hat off was a thing near to a miracle, and he said, low, not looking at anyone, I was wrong about the cattle. And that small grudging crack in a shut and bitter man was the whole of it, and cracks are how the light gets in. He never rode up my father's draw with guns again. And that would be a fine enough place to end the hard part, but the true end of it came a few winters on, and I will tell it because my mother lived it, and it is the truest measure of what she was. There came a winter the diphtheria got into Culver's Crossing, the strangling sickness that goes for the children first and worst, and it went through the flat houses like a fire in dry grass, and it took children out of half the homes on the crossing road, and the one doctor drank himself past use inside a week, and the town was left with nothing but its own terror and its dying young. And into that, in the black of the coldest nights, the desperate mothers of Culver's Crossing began to send. For her. For the Apache woman out on the draw, the healer, my mother, because the word had got round quiet that she had pulled a child back once, and a mother with a strangling child will send for the devil himself if she thinks he can save it. My mother went, every time, into the very town that had chewed on her name and sent Harlan buoyed up her draw with guns, out into the killing cold, night after night with her bundle of plants and her low, steady songs, into house after house of people who had scorned her, and she doctored their children, all of them, the kind and the cruel alike, and she made no account of which was which. She lost some. The strangling sickness takes some no matter whose hands are on them, and she carried each of those small losses the way she carried everything, quiet and deep, and to the end of her life. But she pulled a great many back from the very edge, more than the town had any right to expect, and among the ones she pulled back, one bitter black midnight, was a small boy in a fine house on the good end of the crossing road. Harlan Boyd's boy. I am told, for I was small, but my father was there. He drove her wagon into town that night through the snow. I am told that Harlan Boyd stood in the doorway of his own son's sick room through the long hours of it, and watched an Apache woman kneel over his strangling child in the lamplight and breathe her breath into him and sing her low songs and work her plants down his swollen throat, hour after hour, until near dawn the boy drew a clean breath, and another, and slept, and lived. And I am told that Harlan Boyd, cattleman, hard man, the one man in that whole valley who had fed the fire of the hate for a decade, stood in that doorway and watched his enemy save his son and put his face in his hands and wept like a broken child, and could not speak, and could not for shame even look at her, and that my mother, gathering her bundle to go, stopped by him in the doorway on her way out and laid her hand flat on his shaking arm, once. The way she'd once laid it flat on a table for my grieving father, and said nothing at all, and went out into the snow. After that there was no faction in Culver's Crossing. Not because every heart in it was changed. Hearts don't all change, not ever. That is a thing for stories and not for the world, but because the one man who had kept the fire fed had nothing left in him to feed it with. You cannot go on hating a whole people in the abstract once one of them has knelt all night in your own lamplight and given you back your son. Boyd could not, and without Boyd the fire had no wood, and it went down, and it went out, and it stayed out. That is how a real divide is crossed, not in one grand and bloody day, one held breath at a time, one saved child at a time, one plain true thing said in the dust at a time, until the fence that two peoples climbed and bled on for years is worn down so low and so smooth in the middle of it, that the children, my children, and the grandchildren of the men who'd have shot each other in my father's yard, can simply walk across it and never know it was ever there at all. I was that river's child, the child of the two banks. They named me twice, of course, my father's name for the paper and the law, and my mother's true name for the truth of me, and I have answered to both all my life and been made smaller by neither. I grew up in the cabin in the wildcat draw that my father kept adding rooms onto, one for each of us that came, and I learned my father's cattle and my mother's plants, his English and her tongue, his long still patience and her quick bright courage, and I never once in my whole childhood understood that the two worlds I moved between every day were supposed to be at war, because in our house they were not at war, they were married, they were one hearth. And a child believes his own house is simply how the world is made until the world takes him aside and tells him different. By the time the world got around to telling me different, I was old enough not to believe a word of it. My father lived to be an old man by that stove, and near the very end of him, one deep winter night when his hands had gone too stiff, and nodded to flex the way my mother's medicine had once made them flex again, he told me this whole story straight through, plain, the way he told everything, the fire on his face. And when he was done I asked him. I was a grown man myself by then, with children of my own asleep in the next room he'd built. I asked him what he had thought truly, that first flooded gray morning, when he looked up out of the river with a broken stranger over his saddle and saw her people sitting their horses on the ridge, and knew exactly what it looked like, and knew exactly what one wrong move would cost. And my father, who had crossed the deepest and bloodiest divide on the whole of that frontier, and had never once in all his years bragged of it or made a story of himself, looked a long while into the fire, and then he said, I thought she was drowning, and I had hands. The rest of it, the ridge, the town, Boyd, all the years of it, the rest of it I made up as I went along, same as any man makes up his life as he goes. But that part I never once doubted, start to finish. You see a person going under, son, you go in after them. You don't stand on the bank and reckon the cost. You go in. Everything else is just the current. You go in after the person and the current sorts itself out. He was wrong about that last a little. The current does not sort itself out. My mother sorted it, standing unarmed in the noon dust between 6 guns and a dozen riders, choosing mercy in the one moment when every hand on both sides was near a trigger, kneeling all night in the lamplight of the house of a man who'd have run her off with dogs, giving him back his son. My father opened his hand at the river and my mother built the bridge, plank by plank, over years, out of her own courage and her own mercy. And it took the both of them, and it took years, and it took a saved child in Harlan Boyd's doorway, and the current sorted nothing on its own. But I did not correct him. He was old and near the end, and my mother had already gone on ahead of him. She died the spring before, an old woman full of years, mourned in the crossing where the grown men and women she'd pulled back from the strangling sickness as children carried her, and keen for up in the high country by what was left of her people, mourned honest on both banks of the river she'd bridged. And I understood, sitting there with him in the firelight, that when my father said she was drowning and I had hands, he was not really talking about the Calder anymore, or not only. He was talking about the two of them. They had each of them been going under, in their own separate ways, on their own separate banks. That gray spring the river flooded. He under his buried grief in an empty country. She swept off the rocks with the good roots still in her hand. And they had, each of them, gone in after the other. And they had come up out of it holding on. And all the rest of it, the ridge, the town, Harlan Boyd, the fence climbed one word at a time on a cabin step in the dark. All of it was just the current, and the current did not sort itself out, not for one day of their lives, but they held on through the whole of it anyway, both of them, both hands, and that holding on was the roof over my whole childhood, and it is the truest thing I know or ever will. I am an old man myself now, telling it at my own fire, to my own grandchildren and any young rider who reins in of an evening, and wants to know how the walk-smooth trail between the draw and the high country came to be walk-smooth. The wildcat draw is greener now than it was. My father's ditches did that. The fences stand where they need to and lie down where they don't. Up in the Pinion country, my mother's people are fewer even than they were, and closed and tighter, and that is a grief this whole story cannot mend, and I will not stand here and pretend to you that it can. The bridge she built was real, and it was true, and it did not save her people from the years that came. And I carry that, and I will not lie about it to make the ending softer than the world allowed. But the trail is walked. That much is real too, and I will not lie about that either to make the world seem harder than it was. The trail between the high country and the wildcat draw is a walked and smooth-worn trail, and my grandchildren go up it and come down it as easy and thoughtless as breathing, carrying my mother's true name and my father's law name knotted together in them. And when they cross that country in the evening light, they do not think of themselves as crossing anything at all. And that not thinking, that easy crossing of what once would have cost a life, that is the whole of what my mother and father built. Out of a flood and a fear, and a fence climbed one word at a time in the dark. That is the story. A man went into a spring flood and pulled out a woman who did not need saving half so much as she needed one hand held out to her with nothing on earth wanted back for it. He packed her a horse to lose her, and she chose, of her own road, to stay. 2 whole worlds came within one held breath of blood in a dusty yard, and a woman with empty open hands turned it, in the noon sun, to mercy, and years on, in the lamplight of her enemy's house, sealed it. And out of the whole of it, out of the flood and the ridge and the fence and the guns and the strangling winter, came a home in the wildcat draw, and came me, and came the walk-smooth trail my grandchildren crossed tonight without a single thought for what it cost. My father used to say you go in after the person and let the current sort itself out. I have come, in my own long years, to say it a little truer in his memory and in hers. You go in after the person, and then you hold on. You hold on through the current, both hands, the both of you, for all the long years it takes, and you do not let go, and you do not stand on the bank and count the cost, and you do not pretend the river isn't trying to take you the whole time, because it is. And a home is what you find you're holding, when the two of you finally come up.